They never intended for it to become famous. In fact, for a long time, they preferred that it wasn't mentioned at all. It didn't look impressive. It didn't roar like artillery or thunder across the sky like bombers. There were no parades for it, no medals pinned directly to its steel. And yet, in the places where the war was decided at ground level, where men moved one careful step at a time and survival depended on seconds, this quiet advantage reshaped the battlefield in ways the official reports struggled to explain. Early in the war, commanders believed they understood what would decide victory. Numbers, firepower, logistics, industrial output. Those things mattered, of course, but in the dense forests, shattered towns, and frozen hills where real fighting unfolded, something else began to stand out. Units facing identical conditions, equipped with nearly identical weapons, were producing wildly different results. Some advanced with fewer casualties. Others held ground against superior numbers. Enemy movements were detected sooner, ambushes collapsed before they fully formed, and small patrols seemed to vanish without leaving answers behind. At first, these outcomes were dismissed as luck or individual bravery. War has always produced stories that don't fit neatly into doctrine. But as the months dragged on and casualty lists grew longer, patterns emerged that were impossible to ignore. Reports from different fronts, written by officers who had never met and fought entirely different enemies, began describing the same advantages in the same understated language. They spoke of anticipation, of seeing threats before they revealed themselves, of men who seemed to know where to be and, more importantly, where not to be. The strange thing was that this advantage didn't come from a new rifle or a classified device. It couldn't be created and shipped by the thousands. It couldn't be rushed through a factory line. It had to be learned slowly, often painfully, and it demanded a kind of discipline that could not be enforced by shouting orders. Some senior officers viewed it with suspicion. Others considered it unnecessary, even dangerous, because it relied too heavily on individual judgment rather than centralized control. In the early years of the conflict, military training emphasized uniformity. Soldiers were taught to move the same way, think the same way, react the same way. This approach made sense on paper. Large armies require predictability to function. But predictability has a cost. The enemy learns it. Studies conducted quietly within staff colleges showed that opposing forces were not just reacting to standard tactics, they were anticipating them. The battlefield had become a place where routine was punished and adaptation determined survival. The secret advantage began as an informal response to this reality. It wasn't announced or standardized. It emerged at the edges of the war among men who had little patience for rigid instruction manuals and plenty of experience operating alone. Hunters, scouts, pre-war outdoorsmen, and soldiers who had learned to trust their senses as much as their weapons. They noticed subtle changes others ignored: broken foliage, unnatural silence, a shadow that didn't belong. Individually, these details meant little. Together, they formed an early warning system no machine could replicate at the time. Commanders who recognized its value rarely advertised it. There were reasons for that. First, it was difficult to measure. You could count bullets and tanks, but you couldn't easily quantify awareness, patience, or restraint. Second, teaching it required time, and time was something wartime planners never felt they had enough of. And finally, there was an uncomfortable truth behind it. Not everyone could master it. Promoting something that only a minority of soldiers could effectively use ran against the egalitarian ideals many armies preferred to project. Despite this, the results were undeniable. Patrols trained to operate with this advantage began returning with better intelligence and fewer losses. Defensive positions held longer with less ammunition expended. Enemy attacks were blunted not by overwhelming fire but by absence. Ambushes found no targets. Mines were discovered before they detonated. Traps were triggered harmlessly or not at all. From the enemy's perspective, it felt as though the battlefield itself had turned against them. What made this especially unsettling was that opposing forces sometimes developed similar capabilities independently. This wasn't a national invention or a single doctrine. It was a human response to lethal environments. Wherever the fighting became intimate and prolonged, soldiers adapted in comparable ways. Those adaptations spread quietly, passed from veteran to replacement in whispered advice rather than official lectures. Watch the ground. Listen more than you talk. It feels wrong, it probably is. After the war, historians struggled with how to present this aspect of combat. It didn't fit the grand narratives of industrial might and strategic genius. It suggested that victory often hinged on qualities that could not be mass-produced or centrally controlled. For nations rebuilding and preparing for future conflicts, that was an inconvenient lesson. Much easier to focus on hardware and doctrine than on the unpredictable human element. And so, this advantage faded into footnotes and personal memoirs. Veterans remembered it, of course. They spoke about it when pressed, usually with a shrug as if it were nothing special. But those who experienced it firsthand understood the truth. It wasn't glamorous. It wasn't secret in the sense of being hidden. It was secret because acknowledging it forced uncomfortable questions about how wars are actually won, and how much depends not on weapons alone, but on the men who learn to see before they shoot. By the middle of the war, the significance of this hidden advantage had grown beyond small patrols and skirmishes. Entire campaigns began to hinge on the subtleties of perception, timing, and patience. It wasn't something that could be photographed or broadcast. It left no visible mark on the battlefield. Yet for those trained to exploit it, every movement, every noise, every change in the environment became a message. The soldiers who mastered it learned to read the world as if it were written in a language only they could understand. A language that spoke of danger, opportunity, and survival in equal measure. Field reports from different theaters began hinting at its impact without naming it explicitly. In dense jungles, snipers who employed it would vanish before the enemy could react. In snow-covered forests, small teams moved like shadows, striking only when success was certain. Artillery officers noticed fewer calls for fire support from units who had been trained in this way because they had already avoided the danger or neutralized the threat without gunfire. The enemy's perception of control began to slip. Battles that should have been chaotic became strangely predictable in favor of the soldiers who understood this quiet discipline. What is fascinating is that this advantage didn't require new technology. In fact, it often relied on deliberately avoiding over-reliance on machines. Early in the war, generals and engineers pushed new gadgets, radios, rangefinders, and experimental weapons. Yet paradoxically, soldiers who depended solely on equipment frequently suffered higher losses. The machines could fail, batteries died, radios jammed. But a soldier trained to read the land, to anticipate movement, to understand the enemy's habits, became almost untouchable in the right conditions. One officer summarized it plainly in a report: "A trained mind can see further than any scope and hear further than any microphone." Training for this skill was arduous and subtle. It was not enough to memorize checklists or fire patterns. It required observation, reflection, and the cultivation of instincts honed over months and years of practice. Commanders would pair experienced hunters and outdoorsmen with raw recruits, teaching them not just to follow orders, but to think critically about the environment, the enemy, and their own limitations. Night exercises were common, forcing soldiers to rely on senses other than sight. Terrain became more than a backdrop. It became an active participant in the soldier's strategy. Stories of success spread quickly among the troops. A small unit might infiltrate enemy lines, bypassing sentries and traps, and return with intelligence considered impossible to obtain. Another might hold a ridge against a numerically superior force without calling for artillery because they had anticipated every route of approach. These stories were shared quietly in mess halls and foxholes, often with laughter or disbelief. Senior commanders recognized their effectiveness but were hesitant to formalize the training on a large scale. They feared the time required, the loss of control, and the potential that not all soldiers would master the skills equally. Meanwhile, adversaries began to notice. Reports occasionally surfaced describing opponents who seemed to vanish at will or anticipate every move. Some units adapted, employing similar tactics. In many cases, the opposing soldiers were also hunting or tracking experts pressed into military service, applying the same human intuition under lethal pressure. These clashes, when recorded later, often read like chess matches rather than conventional battles, one side exploiting timing and terrain, the other scrambling to counteract what they could not predict. By the late stages of the war, this quiet weapon had evolved into a fully recognized, though still largely informal, part of operational doctrine. Specialized units were formed to capitalize on it, often composed of men who had proven themselves capable of independent thought and rapid adaptation. They were given minimal supervision and wide latitude to improvise. Their missions were high risk but high reward: reconnaissance, ambush, sabotage, and precision strikes where traditional forces would have failed or suffered excessive losses. Success depended not on brute force, but on subtle mastery of an environment that most soldiers scarcely notice. Memoirs and interviews from veterans who wielded this advantage paint vivid pictures. One recalled moving through a destroyed village at night, every creaking floorboard and shifting shadow analyzed before he stepped. Another described reading the behavior of enemy soldiers in ways that seemed almost psychic, anticipating patrol patterns, detecting traps before they were sprung, and knowing exactly when to strike and when to retreat. In every account, there is a recurring theme. Patience and perception are more deadly than bullets when properly applied. The story of this secret weapon also illuminates a broader truth about human conflict. Technology and numbers may dominate headlines, but wars are often decided by those willing to engage in careful observation, measured risk-taking, and nuanced understanding of terrain and human behavior. This principle is timeless, appearing in accounts from ancient skirmishes to modern special operations. It is, in essence, a weapon that lives in the mind rather than in the factory, a tool forged by experience, honed by observation, and executed through discipline. By now, the influence of this hidden weapon had reached a scale that reshaped entire campaigns, though few outside the immediate theaters of war understood its impact. Commanders who integrated it into their strategy noticed an almost uncanny efficiency. Smaller units achieving objectives with fewer casualties, reconnaissance yielding intelligence that seemed impossible to gather, and ambushes executed with surgical precision. It wasn't flashy or widely publicized, but its effectiveness spoke for itself in after-action reports and battlefield outcomes. The key to its potency lay in the element of unpredictability. Conventional warfare relies heavily on patterns, routines, and predictability: troop movements, supply lines, artillery schedules. But soldiers trained in this secret discipline operated outside of those expected norms. They moved when the enemy assumed they would be resting, struck where defenses were weakest, and vanished before reinforcements could arrive. Observers often described encounters with these units as ghostly, giving rise to whispered reputations and tales that blurred the line between fact and legend. Part of the challenge was convincing the higher command of its value without overexposing its methods. While field officers saw its tangible results, generals accustomed to traditional metrics, manpower, firepower, and territory gained, struggled to quantify it. Reports that highlighted the skill and intuition of these soldiers were often met with skepticism. Some commanders dismissed them as lucky or anecdotal, unaware that what they were witnessing was the culmination of careful training, relentless practice, and a philosophy that prized mental acuity over brute strength. Despite skepticism, there were undeniable successes that could not be ignored. In the dense jungles of Southeast Asia, for instance, a small reconnaissance team infiltrated deep behind enemy lines and returned with actionable intelligence that allowed an entire division to avoid a trap. In North Africa, a handful of sharpshooters, using techniques derived from this secret weapon, held strategic points against far larger forces without a single friendly casualty. Every such instance reinforced the principle: mastery of perception, patience, and environmental awareness could achieve what raw numbers and technology often could not. The soldiers themselves often described the experience in almost mystical terms. One veteran likened it to seeing the world differently, where subtle cues, an overturned leaf, a slight disturbance in the dust, a distant sound became signals, warning, and guidance. It required acute focus and an almost meditative presence in the field. This was not taught through manuals alone. It was absorbed through mentorship, repetition, and immersion in the very environments where it would be applied. Experience, not instruction, was the true teacher. Interestingly, this hidden advantage also fostered a unique form of camaraderie. Soldiers who mastered it often formed tight-knit units because trust was paramount. Each individual had to anticipate and complement the actions of others flawlessly. A single misstep could compromise a mission. Shared experiences in which survival depended on intellect, observation, and quick judgment created bonds stronger than those formed by simply enduring hardship together. Veterans frequently recalled that the people they served with in these units were among the most capable and reliable comrades they ever knew. Opposition also started adapting, though often too late or insufficiently. Reports emerged of enemies becoming wary of seemingly empty terrain, suspicious of natural cover, and cautious of predictable routines. In some cases, entire units were thrown off balance by encounters with soldiers using this subtle skill set. Commanders documented how enemy patrols would halt, reroute, or delay movement simply because the presence of highly perceptive units made them uncertain about their immediate safety. The psychological effect was just as potent as the physical results. Fear of the unseen forced hesitation, which in turn created opportunities. This weapon's influence was further amplified by its versatility. It wasn't restricted to a single role. Soldiers trained in its use could conduct reconnaissance, sabotage, sniping, and even engage in conventional firefights with enhanced situational awareness. Unlike heavy equipment or specialized artillery, it could be deployed anywhere at any time and adapted to shifting circumstances. Its greatest strength was that it scaled with experience. A recruit might take months to learn the subtleties, while a seasoned operative could exploit them almost instinctively. Beyond the battlefield, the impact extended to intelligence operations. Information gathered by units employing these techniques often revealed enemy weaknesses that were previously undetected. Logistics hubs, supply convoys, and command structures were mapped with incredible accuracy. In many cases, the intelligence allowed planners to strike decisively, reducing casualties and maximizing strategic advantage. By combining mental acuity with field experience, these soldiers effectively turned observation into a weapon, making knowledge itself a form of lethal power. Perhaps most compelling is the way this story challenges conventional narratives of war. Popular accounts often focus on massive battles, heroic charges, or revolutionary weapons. Yet history demonstrates that wars are often shaped as much by subtle mastery as by brute force. The secret weapon in question exemplifies this truth. It teaches that adaptability, perception, and patience can outweigh technology and numbers in the right hands. It is a testament to human ingenuity under pressure, a reminder that sometimes the most powerful tools are those that cannot be easily seen, measured, or replicated. As this hidden weapon evolved, so too did the methods by which it was taught and refined. Training programs became less about rote repetition and more about developing intuition and situational awareness. Instructors emphasized reading the environment, understanding enemy behavior, and predicting outcomes based on subtle cues that most overlook. Trainees would spend hours observing the forest, desert, or urban landscape, learning to anticipate not only what might happen, but what seemed likely to be ignored. This immersive approach created a mindset where every detail mattered and every action had weight. What set this apart from conventional military training was the insistence on creative problem-solving under pressure. Standard drills taught soldiers to react to predefined scenarios, but this secret system trained them to think in terms of probabilities and patterns rather than memorize sequences. An ambush was not just avoided, it was anticipated, manipulated, and sometimes turned against the enemy. The emphasis was on becoming unpredictable while remaining relentlessly effective. One veteran described it as playing chess where the pieces keep moving on their own. Another aspect of its power was the integration of observation with patience. Soldiers learned to wait for the exact moment to act, even if it meant hours or days of inaction. In conventional thinking, this could be perceived as hesitation, but in reality, it was a calculated strategy. By allowing the enemy to expose weaknesses, waste resources, or make errors, these soldiers maximized impact while minimizing risk. Every engagement was the result of deliberate choice, not instinct alone, blending timing, perception, and restraint into a potent formula. The psychological element cannot be understated. Both allies and enemies were affected by the presence of operatives using these techniques. Friendly units often found their confidence boosted when operating alongside them, knowing they had eyes and judgment that exceeded standard capability. Conversely, adversaries felt a creeping uncertainty, an awareness that their actions might be anticipated and countered before they even realized it. This intangible pressure forced mistakes and created opportunities that could be exploited with precision. Field accounts reveal countless examples of this advantage in action. In one engagement, a small team of operatives infiltrated enemy positions under the cover of night, mapping out defensive layouts and supply routes without alerting the opposition. The intelligence they provided allowed larger units to maneuver with minimal resistance, securing objectives that would have otherwise required costly frontal assaults. In another instance, a single operative identified a series of concealed enemy observation posts simply by noting subtle environmental disturbances, details that standard reconnaissance had overlooked. These small but decisive interventions highlight how nuanced skill can redefine outcome. Equally remarkable was the adaptability of these techniques across different terrains and climates. From dense jungles to arid deserts, from snowy mountains to urban centers, the principles remained consistent, though the application varied. Soldiers were trained to blend with their surroundings, move silently, and exploit natural cover. Their mastery of camouflage, both visual and auditory, created an almost invisible presence on the battlefield. In effect, they became part of the environment itself, forcing enemies to operate in a state of constant uncertainty. The effectiveness of this weapon also depended heavily on discipline and ethics. Operatives were held to exacting standards, not only in skill but in judgment. Using this advantage required restraint. Unnecessary engagement could compromise a mission, while misuse could endanger entire units. This balance between capability and responsibility created a class of soldiers who were not only lethal but precise in their judgment. Many veterans later noted that the experience instilled a lifelong habit of measured, deliberate decision-making, extending far beyond the battlefield. Interestingly, its influence reached beyond traditional combat roles. Special operations, intelligence agencies, and even law enforcement units observed and adapted elements of these techniques. While the full system remained classified or closely guarded, components like observation skills, risk assessment, and pattern recognition found applications in espionage, counterterrorism, and rescue operations. In each case, the underlying principle remained. Mastery of perception and timing can achieve what brute force alone cannot. The ripple effects of this weapon also extended to strategy and logistics. Commanders learned to incorporate its potential into larger operational plans, using small, highly skilled teams to shape the battlefield before main forces engaged. By anticipating enemy movements, creating diversions, and gathering intelligence, these units acted as force multipliers. A single operative in the right position could save hundreds of lives, redirect an enemy advance, or secure critical resources without firing a shot. It was a paradigm shift in how warfare could be conducted. Finally, the legacy of the secret weapon is a lesson in humility and ingenuity. While many technological marvels, tanks, aircraft, missiles dominate histories of war, it is often subtle mastery that proves decisive. The soldiers trained in these methods achieved extraordinary results not through gadgets, but through observation, patience, and intelligence. They remind us that human skill, refined under pressure and guided by insight, can surpass expectations and redefine possibilities. They teach a timeless lesson: the most powerful weapons are often invisible, relying on the mind as much as the body. The final layer of this secret weapon lay in its integration with broader operational intelligence. Unlike conventional forces, which often relied on rigid chains of command and compartmentalized information, units trained in this method functioned almost as living networks. Each operative was both a source and a recipient of real-time intelligence, constantly updating situational awareness and adapting tactics on the fly. This fluid communication ensured that the right decisions were made at the right moment, often before higher command even realized the need for intervention. Technology complemented but never replaced human judgment. While drones, surveillance equipment, and encrypted communication provided valuable data, the core advantage remained rooted in perception and interpretation. Operatives could detect anomalies, patterns, and subtle cues that no device could fully capture. It was the ability to see the unseen, to anticipate the invisible movements of an enemy, that made this approach revolutionary. In many historical engagements, reports indicate that missions succeeded where conventional reconnaissance had failed, precisely because of this human-centered intelligence. The psychological warfare component deserves special attention. Operatives were trained to influence enemy behavior subtly. By controlling what the enemy could observe and predict, they created a state of constant doubt and hesitation. Decisions made under this pressure were often slower, less coordinated, and more prone to error. In some cases, entire operations were altered not by direct confrontation, but by the fear and uncertainty planted. Rough, meticulous planning and calculated presence. It is a rare form of influence where visibility is minimized but impact is maximized. In operational theaters, these soldiers acted as force multipliers, often outnumbered but never outmatched in effect. Accounts detail small teams neutralizing critical threats, disrupting supply chains, and providing actionable intelligence that enabled broader success. The elegance of these operations lay in efficiency, achieving maximum effect with minimum expenditure of resources, lives, and energy. Unlike traditional confrontations, which could be costly and chaotic, these missions reflected a disciplined application of knowledge and skill. The adaptability of these methods is perhaps most striking. Soldiers trained in this system could operate in extreme environments, from the frozen expanses of northern climates to dense, humid jungles, and from urban sprawls to rugged mountain passes. Each environment presented unique challenges, yet the principles observation, timing, stealth, and psychological acuity remained constant. Equipment and tactics were adjusted accordingly, but the underlying framework of awareness and calculated response never wavered. This versatility turned every operative into a force capable of transcending limitations imposed by terrain, weather, or enemy numbers. Beyond the battlefield, this weapon influenced strategy at every level. Commanders recognized that the presence of these units allowed for more flexible and creative planning. They could deploy main forces with confidence, knowing that key points had been scouted, threats neutralized, and enemy movements anticipated. The margin of error in large-scale operations shrank, and the potential for decisive victories grew. It is a testament to the idea that a small, highly skilled force can shape outcomes far beyond its immediate numbers. Ethical considerations were deeply embedded in the training and operational philosophy. Unlike conventional units that might rely on sheer firepower, these soldiers were expected to exercise restraint and precision. Engagement was always calculated, proportional, and intended to achieve the mission with minimal collateral impact. This discipline ensured that the advantages of their skill were sustainable, repeatable, and respected by allies and adversaries alike. Misuse or recklessness was not just a tactical risk. It was a fundamental violation of the principles underpinning the entire system. The human stories emerging from this weapon are profound. Veterans recount moments where their preparation and observation directly saved lives, prevented ambushes, or turned the tide of engagements. They describe the confidence instilled by training, the trust in teammates, and the quiet satisfaction of executing complex strategies flawlessly. These narratives highlight the depth of skill, courage, and intellect required to operate at this level, and they underscore why this approach remains legendary among those who have witnessed its effectiveness firsthand. In retrospect, the legacy of this secret weapon underscores a timeless truth about conflict. Technological superiority alone does not guarantee success. Human ingenuity, adaptability, and psychological mastery often determine the outcome. By investing in observation, critical thinking, and patient, calculated action, a relatively small force can achieve disproportionate results. These soldiers demonstrated that subtlety and intellect, when combined with courage and discipline, can rival the most formidable conventional advantages. Finally, the story of this weapon challenges our perception of power. It reveals that true influence may reside not in what is seen or celebrated, but in the unseen mastery of those who prepare, anticipate, and act with precision. It reminds us that the most effective tools are not necessarily the largest, loudest, or most technologically advanced, but those honed through observation, discipline, and insight. It is a lesson that extends beyond warfare into leadership, strategy, and life itself. Understanding, timing, and subtlety can be far more decisive than brute force alone. As we move into the final chapter of this story, it's important to reflect on the magnitude of what the secret weapon represented, not just in terms of raw military effectiveness, but as a profound illustration of human potential. Throughout history, countless battles have been fought with overwhelming numbers, heavy firepower, and advanced technology. Yet time and again, it has been strategy, adaptability, and intelligence that has turned the tide. The soldiers trained in this secret methodology exemplified precisely this principle. They remind us that preparation, observation, and calculated decision-making often outweigh sheer force. Every operation they undertook was a masterclass in precision. Whether navigating treacherous terrain, operating behind enemy lines, or making split-second decisions under immense pressure, these operatives showcase the power of human intellect harnessed with discipline. Consider for a moment the psychological burden of their work. Every choice carried enormous stakes, not only for themselves, but for the success of entire missions and the lives of fellow soldiers. Yet they thrived not because of luck, but because of rigorous training, relentless focus, and an almost intuitive understanding of human behavior. This wasn't just skill, it was art. The adaptability we've seen in these operations is what made this weapon truly revolutionary. A team could face a dense jungle one day and an urban battlefield the next. Weather, terrain, and enemy tactics changed constantly, but the underlying principles remained constant. Careful observation, patience, precise timing, and strategic influence over the enemy. Their training instilled not just proficiency with weapons, but mastery of their environment and a profound understanding of cause and effect in human conflict. In essence, they became living instruments of strategy, capable of anticipating problems before they arose and influencing outcomes with minimal exposure or risk. It's also worth considering the ripple effects of such operations. While these soldiers often operated in small teams, the consequences of their actions extended far beyond immediate skirmishes. By neutralizing threats early, providing critical intelligence, and shaping enemy behavior, they enabled entire campaigns to succeed. Their work reduced casualties among conventional forces, shortened operational timelines, and shifted the strategic balance in ways that were often invisible to the public eye. Few realized the full scale of their impact at the time, yet their legacy continues to resonate in modern military strategy. What makes this story so compelling, beyond tactics and technology, is the human element. These operatives were not superheroes. They were ordinary men and women pushed to extraordinary heights by training, circumstance, and necessity. Their courage was quiet but relentless, their ingenuity a testament to the human capacity to adapt under pressure. Their discipline, often unnoticed outside the inner circles of military history, is a lesson for all of us. Preparation, mental acuity, and adaptability create advantages that no sheer number or weapon system can match. Even today, modern forces study these operations to glean lessons in efficiency, intelligence gathering, and psychological strategy. Commanders emphasize flexibility, observation, and rapid adaptation, principles that were honed decades ago by this secret weapon. In a broader sense, the story serves as a metaphor for problem-solving in any high-stakes environment. Teaches us to anticipate, to think critically, and to act decisively when the stakes are highest. The principles of observation, timing, and influence extend far beyond the battlefield, applying to business, leadership, negotiation, and everyday decision-making. And this is the key takeaway. The most powerful weapons are not always visible, nor are they always explosive. Sometimes the greatest impact comes from foresight, preparation, and the ability to influence outcomes subtly but decisively. The soldiers behind this secret weapon operated in the shadows, yet their impact was profound. They turned the intangible information, observation, timing into a tangible advantage, shaping history in ways most could not immediately perceive. Their story forces us to reconsider what we define as power, reminding us that intellect, strategy, and subtle influence can be far more decisive than brute strength. Now, as we conclude, it's crucial to bring this story home to you, our audience. What lessons can we take from these unsung heroes? Firstly, never underestimate the value of preparation. Knowledge and awareness are tools you carry with you everywhere. Secondly, adaptability is key. Situations will always evolve, and your ability to pivot intelligently is what separates success from failure. And lastly, understand the power of subtle influence. Often, the quiet, calculated actions, those that go unnoticed by the masses, have the most profound outcomes. As you reflect on this story, think about how these lessons can apply to your own life. Whether it's in business, education, personal goals, or even relationships, preparation, observation, and strategic action can make you more effective than relying solely on visible effort or brute force. Just as these soldiers reshaped outcomes through skill and foresight, you too can reshape your own world by mastering the unseen factors that influence success. If this story resonated with you, there's more to explore. We dive into the untold stories of unsung heroes, the covert strategies that changed history, and the lessons that extend far beyond the battlefield. Make sure to hit the subscribe button, turn on notifications, and join our growing community of history enthusiasts and strategists. Every week we uncover real events, hidden strategies, and the lessons behind them, giving you insights you won't find in textbooks or mainstream media. Your engagement makes a difference too. Like this video if you found these insights compelling, and share it with friends who love history, strategy, or real-life tales of extraordinary courage. Leave a comment below with your thoughts, perhaps a story of someone you know who embodied these principles in real life. We love hearing from you, and your stories could be featured in future videos, continuing the legacy of highlighting those who operated with skill, courage, and intelligence against all odds. Finally, remember this: true power isn't always loud, and influence isn't always visible. It's cultivated, honed, and applied with precision. From the jungles of past conflicts to the challenges we face today, the lessons of this secret weapon remain timeless. Observation, discipline, strategic thinking, and subtle influence. These are the tools that shape outcomes, define success, and leave a legacy. Take these lessons, apply them in your life, and remember the unsung heroes who showed that the most effective force often operates quietly but decisively.